I haven't made up my mind about these questions. Um, the new Republican Party, and I'm already conceding an argument by saying that it's a new thing, all comes down to Trump. And then you can debate whether Donald Trump is a reaction to something else or whether there's a question of whether Trump is the result or the cause. And of course, to some extent, he's both. Human motives and causation are complicated. But it comes down to Trump. And my thinking about Trump runs as follows. When he was president, he had 3 pretty good years in policy terms. I couldn't stand listening to him any more than anybody else could, but it turned out all you had to do was block him on Twitter and refuse to turn on the evening news, and you could live a Trump-free life perfectly easily. And you got the benefit of the economic expansion. He cut taxes. He cut the corporate tax most. In other words, he enacted a largely Republican agenda. He produces a tax cut. He mouths off at the Europeans for failing to deliver in their share of NATO expenses. It turns out that was not a new position. Administrations had been barking at the Europeans for a long time. What Trump did was bark at them in public. He doesn't cut NATO expenditures. He doesn't reduce our troops. He yaks at the Europeans. That's what he does. He yaks at them and he says true things. And the true things are, you've all agreed to spend 2% of GDP on defense each year. Most of you aren't doing so and haven't done so for many years. What's going on here? Fair argument. It unsettled people because he was so direct and brusque about it. It offended European sensibilities, but he wasn't saying anything that hadn't been American policy for a long time. He was accused of saying things about Putin that made him sound as though he was cozying up to Putin. Well, American troops get deployed in Poland. He puts up, in other words, you listen to Donald Trump yak and you get one thing, but if you look at the actual policy, you get something else. And that something else struck me as as acceptable, and in a number of cases more than acceptable. He shut down very substantially. He never built the wall, but his administration very substantially shut down illegal immigration. You can't function as a country if your borders become meaningless. And he grasped that, and Americans overwhelmingly grasped it themselves. He and his administration shut it down. On China, he has, excuse me, so let me say that I grant the argument that he's a loudmouth and a buffoon in many ways, and I can understand entirely why that annoyed many people. I don't quite understand why it drove so many people clinically insane, but I can understand why it annoyed them and angered them. And again, my own reaction was to block him on Twitter and change the channel whenever he appeared on television. Perfectly easy to live a Trump-free life. On China, there's going into the Trump administration, China's not recognized as a danger or a threat. You still get the lingering view that that maybe even now they may turn into a South Korea or a Taiwan. Open markets, economic growth may yet lead to political freedom, democracy, the way it did in South Korea and Taiwan. And Trump is the one who achieves a bipartisan consensus. By the time Trump leaves office, both parties see China as a danger. And China is difficult in that we've got really only 2 levers to pull in dealing with them. One is military, and nobody's eager to pull that lever. And the other is economic. So in spite of Republican orthodoxy that we need to encourage free trade everywhere we can, Trump slaps tariffs on China. But it's very hard to imagine what else any president could have done. Okay, so you get all of that. 3 pretty good years because he's being, in policy terms, he's being fundamentally conservative. Then comes COVID. It's a catastrophe. and his failure is total. He permits the federal bureaucrats essentially to assume emergency powers and shut down the entire economy. Schools. It's a catastrophe. And it's because he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know that you can't trust federal authorities. You can't trust the bureaucracy to do its job properly. And then we get the election, which he loses, and then he becomes really so there are three phases of Trump, three pretty good years, one very bad year, and then after the election, something changes in him and it really becomes outrageous and thoroughly unacceptable. So that's Trump as I view him. Now, what's going on in the Republican Party? You've got, they're saying we don't want to spend money on Ukraine, at least not without. So there is an impulse toward isolationism, toward withdrawing from the world. That's not good. On the other hand, some Republicans are saying we don't want to spend any more money on Ukraine until you tell us how this is going to end, until the administration pulls itself together and comes up with some kind of coordinated strategy, and until an auditor is named to examine how our money is being spent, and we can be sure that Ukrainian officials aren't stuffing large sums of American money into Swiss bank accounts. Well, okay, now those arguments strike me as reasonable. It's very interesting in the Middle East now. The Republican Party is pretty universally supporting Israel, and the Democratic Party is split in two on that. So Republicans, there's also an argument that I don't quite buy, but it's an impulse I understand. We're not spending any money on anything until the administration closes this border, gets the border under control. Again, that's an impulse I can understand. Isolationism, withdrawing from the world, that would be a terrible mistake. But at the same time, even as they say these things, Republicans are voting for increases in defense spending. They're not in defending our Navy. Ukraine is a problem by itself. Okay, so what do we end up with? We end up with a Republican Party that is more emphatic about gaining control of the border. That's fine by me. We end up with a Republican Party in which some elements really are intent on withdrawing from the world. That's not fine with me, but I don't see it yet, and I hope it never will become the dominant element in the Republican Party. And then we've got a Republican Party that is much less committed to free trade, much more willing to slap tariffs on China, but and that's not acceptable. Well, China is a special case, though. So if what you're getting as I yak and yak and yak is evidence that you're speaking to a tortured soul who's very upset and can't quite figure out which direction his own party is going in, if that's what you are deducing from the way I'm yakking, you are making a correct deduction.